What you're about to witness will fundamentally change how you view congressional transparency forever. This isn't another political theater performance or manufactured controversy designed to generate headlines. This is the complete, unfiltered account of the moment when decades of behind the scenes deal making finally collided with irrefutable evidence. And the fallout was unlike anything Congress has seen in modern memory. The setting was supposed to be routine. Another oversight hearing, another day of predictable partisan exchanges that would fade from memory within hours. Committee members shuffled papers, staffers checked phones, and journalists prepared for the usual sound bites. Nobody expected what was coming next would expose a systematic pattern of deception that reaches into the very heart of how laws are actually made in America. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat quietly at her place on the committee dais, a stack of documents beside her that would soon send shockwaves through the political establishment. Across from her, Chairman Jim Jordan appeared confident, almost dismissive, unaware that his entire public persona was about to be systematically dismantled in front of a live audience and rolling cameras. But here's what makes this story truly unprecedented. Crockett wasn't operating on hunches, rumors, or political speculation. She had spent months building an evidence file so comprehensive, so meticulously authenticated, that it would prove impossible to dismiss through the usual procedural deflections and partisan attacks. What she was about to unveil would force a reckoning not just with one chairman's contradictions, but with the entire culture of legislative opacity that has dominated Washington for decades. The hearing began like countless others. Jordan, veteran of numerous high-profile congressional confrontations, settled into his familiar role as the aggressive questioner, the defender of conservative principles, the man who had built his reputation on holding others accountable. His supporters in the gallery nodded approvingly as he outlined the day's agenda with the confidence of someone who had controlled countless similar proceedings. Legislative experts present that day later described the atmosphere as deceptively calm. Professor Ellen Richardson from Georgetown Law, who studies congressional procedure, was there as part of an academic delegation observing committee operations. She would later describe the initial moments as utterly routine, with no indication that we were about to witness one of the most methodical deconstructions of committee leadership credibility in recent congressional history. The transformation began with what seemed like a straightforward question. Crockett's voice carried the measured tone of someone who had done their homework thoroughly, but there was something underneath, a quiet confidence that suggested she knew exactly where this conversation was heading. Mr. Chairman, she began, her words cutting through the low murmur of routine committee business. You've made numerous public statements about the transparency of this committee's work on H.R. 47-2-1. Specifically, you've told the American people, both on national television and in formal committee settings, that there have been absolutely no private negotiations and no special arrangements with outside interests regarding this legislation. Is that an accurate characterization of your public position? The question seemed innocent enough, but experienced congressional watchers immediately recognized its strategic importance. By asking Jordan to confirm his public statements first, Crockett was establishing the foundation for what legislative procedure experts call accountability documentation, creating an official record of claims that could then be measured against evidence. Jordan's response revealed no awareness of the trap being set. His voice carried the same confident tone that had characterized thousands of similar exchanges throughout his career. That's absolutely correct, Representative Crockett. This committee has conducted all of its business with complete transparency and full accountability to the American people. Every aspect of our work on this legislation has been conducted according to proper House procedures, with appropriate public oversight. The words seemed to echo in the committee room with unusual weight. Several members glanced up from their papers, sensing something different in the exchange, but unable to identify exactly what had changed. In the gallery, journalists who had been half listening suddenly became more attentive, their instincts telling them that routine committee business was about to become something else entirely. Social media began capturing the moment immediately. Congressional oversight accounts started posting clips of Jordan's confident assertion, with early reactions splitting along predictable partisan lines. Conservative supporters praised his commitment to transparency, while progressive critics prepared their standard responses about Republican hypocrisy. None of them suspected they were witnessing the opening moves of something far more significant than typical political theater. What happened next would be studied in political science classes for years to come. Crockett didn't immediately challenge Jordan's statement or launch into a partisan attack. Instead, she did something that revealed the depth of her preparation and the sophistication of her strategy. She gave him another opportunity to clarify his position, creating multiple layers of documented commitment to his transparency claims. I appreciate that clarification, Mr. Chairman, and I want to make sure I understand your position completely. When you say there have been no private negotiations, you're specifically referring to H.R. 4721 and its various provisions, including the regulatory framework outlined in Section 302. Is that correct? The specificity was telling. By referencing Section 302 directly, Crockett was signaling that she had detailed knowledge of the legislation's components. Jordan, however, seemed to interpret this as standard committee business rather than the precise targeting it actually represented. That's correct, Jordan replied, leaning slightly forward with the body language of someone emphasizing a point. Every provision of this legislation has been developed through proper committee procedures with full transparency and accountability. The committee room remained quiet, but the energy had shifted in a way that was difficult to define. Several staff members had stopped their background activities and were paying closer attention to the exchange. In the gallery, academic observers and policy experts began taking more detailed notes, sensing they might be witnessing something significant. Dr. Michael Harrison, a specialist in legislative procedure from Harvard's Kennedy School, was present as part of a research project on committee operations. He later described this moment as the completion of what I recognized as a classical accountability framework. Representative Crockett had secured multiple specific confirmations of Chairman Jordan's public position, creating a documented baseline that couldn't later be modified or recontextualized. What Crockett did next demonstrated why months of preparation had been necessary. Rather than immediately producing evidence, she continued building her foundation, ensuring that every possible escape route had been systematically closed off before revealing the contradictory documentation. Thank you for that comprehensive clarification, Mr. Chairman. Before we proceed with today's regular business, I'd like to submit several items for the committee's review. These documents have been properly authenticated through the House Legislative Resource Center and have undergone the required chain of custody procedures as outlined in House Rule Owings. The mention of formal authentication procedures immediately caught the attention of committee counsel. Experienced staffers recognized that Crockett was invoking the most rigorous standards for document submission, suggesting that whatever she was about to present had been prepared with exceptional thoroughness. Jordan's initial reaction revealed no particular concern. As chairman, he was accustomed to members submitting various materials for committee consideration. His expression remained neutral as he nodded for the process to continue, still unaware that his entire public credibility was about to be systematically challenged. The first item I'd like to submit is Exhibit A, authenticated meeting minutes from March 17, 2023, documenting a session between committee leadership, specific staff members, and representatives from 5 manufacturing companies directly affected by H.R. 4721's regulatory provisions. The reaction in the committee room was immediate and unmistakable. Jordan's expression shifted from casual attention to sharp focus, his posture straightening as the implications of Crockett's words registered. Committee counsel immediately began consulting procedural manuals, while staff members exchanged glances that suggested they recognized the potential significance of what was being introduced. I object to the submission of documents that haven't been reviewed by committee leadership for sensitive or privileged information, Jordan said quickly, his voice carrying a tension that hadn't been present moments before. The objection revealed that Jordan understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't routine document submission. It was the beginning of a comprehensive challenge to his public statements, backed by authenticated evidence that could potentially devastate his credibility. Ranking Member Nadler, who had been quietly observing the exchange, leaned toward his microphone. Mr. Chairman, if I may address the procedural question, under House Rule 18, Section 2G, 3, evidence related to committee transparency and accountability may be withheld from preliminary review when disclosure might compromise the integrity of oversight proceedings. The ranking member has been properly notified. and the authentication procedures appear to be in full compliance with House standards. The parliamentary ruling effectively eliminated Jordan's ability to prevent the documents from being reviewed. More importantly, it confirmed that Crockett had followed every required procedure, making it impossible to dismiss her evidence on technical grounds. As committee staff distributed copies of the meeting minutes, the atmosphere in the room became electric with tension. Journalists in the gallery leaned forward in their seats, recognizing that they might be witnessing something unprecedented. Academic observers stopped taking routine notes and began documenting what they sensed could become a historically significant moment in congressional oversight. The documents themselves were devastating in their precision and detail. Rather than vague references or ambiguous language, they contained specific quotes, explicit agreements, and detailed action items that directly contradicted every public statement Jordan had made about the committee's transparency. Page 3 of the minutes contained language that would soon be quoted across every major news platform. Chairman Jordan confirmed that regulatory exemptions, as specifically drafted by industry representatives, would be incorporated directly into the final committee print without modification. The chairman emphasized that these arrangements must remain confidential, with public messaging focused on regulatory efficiency rather than specific industry accommodations. The silence that followed the document distribution was profound. Even veteran committee members, accustomed to political theater and manufactured controversies, recognized that they were witnessing something different. This wasn't partisan grandstanding or speculative accusations. It was documented evidence of systematic contradiction between public claims and private reality. Jordan's reaction was visible to everyone in the committee room. His face flushed noticeably, his hand moved repeatedly to adjust his tie, and he leaned urgently toward committee counsel in what body language experts would later identify as classic defensive positioning. The confident chairman who had begun the hearing was being systematically replaced by someone struggling to maintain composure under unprecedented pressure. These appear to be internal working documents that may not reflect final committee positions. Jordan managed, his voice carrying a defensive tone that contrasted sharply with his earlier confidence. Crockett was ready with a response that demonstrated the thoroughness of her preparation. I appreciate your concern about context, Mr. Chairman, which is why I've prepared Exhibit B. Your public statements on committee transparency made on the same dates as these documented meetings. She produced another set of authenticated materials, this one containing transcripts, video footage, and press releases that created a timeline of Jordan's public claims alongside the private negotiations documented in the meeting minutes. What's particularly notable, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved through her prepared presentation, is that some of these public denials of private negotiations occurred within hours of the very meetings documented in these minutes. In at least 3 instances, you left sessions with industry representatives and immediately told reporters that no such meetings were taking place. The precision of the contradiction eliminated any possibility of claiming misunderstanding or mischaracterization. Jordan wasn't just being accused of private negotiations. He was being confronted with documented evidence that he had actively misled the public about those negotiations while they were actually occurring. The committee room erupted in a way that veteran congressional observers described as unprecedented. What began as surprised murmurs quickly escalated into something approaching chaos as the implications of Crockett's revelation rippled through the chamber. From the public gallery, someone called out, "Tell the truth!" in a voice that carried across the committee room despite the formal setting. Rather than the isolated disruption that might normally be quickly suppressed, this seemed to release a wave of reaction that had been building as the evidence was presented. Within seconds, other voices joined in. Calls of "transparency now" and sustained applause echoed through the chamber as members of the public reacted to what they had witnessed. The spontaneous response, highly unusual in the controlled environment of congressional hearings, reflected the powerful impact of seeing documented evidence of the gap between public claims and private reality. Chairman Jordan, now visibly agitated, called for order repeatedly, but his gavel strikes were completely overwhelmed by the continuing public reaction. Security personnel moved toward the gallery, but the disruption continued to build rather than subside, as more people joined the vocal response to Crockett's revelations. The acting parliamentarian, recognizing that standard procedures were insufficient to address the unprecedented situation, whispered urgently to the acting chairman about options for restoring order. The continued public reaction, far from being a brief outburst, seemed to reflect genuine outrage at the documented evidence of systematic deception. When relative quiet was finally restored after several minutes of sustained disruption, the energy in the committee room had fundamentally changed. What had begun as routine oversight had transformed into a public reckoning with evidence of behind the scenes dealing that could no longer be hidden or dismissed. Jordan, recognizing that his standard approaches to committee management were failing, attempted a different strategy. "Mr. Acting Chairman," he said, his voice carrying clear strain, "I request an immediate recess to review these materials and consult with counsel regarding their authenticity and appropriate response." But Crockett wasn't finished. Her months of preparation had equipped her for exactly this moment, and she had additional evidence that would make any recess meaningless. Before we recess, Mr. Chairman, I think it's important for the committee and the public to understand the full scope of what these documents reveal. This isn't about isolated meetings or occasional stakeholder outreach. This is about a systematic pattern of private negotiations while publicly claiming complete transparency. She produced her final exhibit, a comprehensive analysis that tied together multiple instances of private negotiations with timeline comparisons to public statements denying such negotiations. Exhibit C documents 12 separate instances over 6 months where private negotiations occurred on the same days as public statements denying such negotiations. This includes industry representatives being given direct input on regulatory language while other stakeholders were explicitly excluded from the process. The methodical presentation had created an overwhelming evidentiary record that couldn't be dismissed through procedural objections or claims of partisan motivation. Jordan found himself confronted not with political accusations, but with documented proof of systematic contradiction between his public statements and private actions. The impact extended far beyond the committee room. Social media exploded with reactions as clips of the exchange spread across platforms. Within hours, hashtags related to congressional transparency were trending nationally as people shared videos of Jordan's visible discomfort and Crockett's methodical presentation of evidence. Conservative media initially attempted to frame the confrontation as a procedural ambush, but even sympathetic commentators struggled to address the specific documentation Crockett had presented. The authenticity of the evidence and the precision of the contradictions made standard defensive strategies ineffective. Liberal commentators focused on the broader implications, with many noting that this represented exactly the kind of evidence-based accountability that transparency advocates had been demanding for years. The systematic nature of the documentation made it impossible to dismiss as partisan theater or political grandstanding. Legislative procedure experts found themselves in the unusual position of praising the thoroughness of congressional oversight. Dr. Norman Ornstein, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, noted that, regardless of political affiliation, Representative Crockett's documentation of contradictions between public statements and private negotiations represents the kind of accountability framework that strengthens democratic institutions. The aftermath in Congress was immediate and significant. Within 48 hours of the hearing, Speaker Johnson announced the formation of a bipartisan working group to review committee transparency procedures across all House committees. The unprecedented nature of Crockett's documentation had created pressure for systematic reform that transcended partisan divisions. Behind the scenes, the political implications were being calculated frantically. Jordan's team conducted emergency strategy sessions to develop responses that could address the specific evidence without creating additional contradictions. Committee offices throughout Congress began reviewing their own practices, recognizing that the era of unaccountable private negotiations might be ending. The human impact was equally significant. In political science departments across the country, professors began incorporating the exchange into their curriculum as an example of effective legislative oversight. Students studying democratic accountability suddenly had a concrete example of how systematic evidence presentation could challenge institutional opacity. Journalism schools also took notice, with several programs using Crockett's methodology as a case study in evidence based reporting. The thoroughness of her documentation and the precision of her presentation provided a template for accountability journalism that transcended traditional partisan frameworks. Perhaps most importantly, the exchange seemed to shift public expectations about congressional transparency. Polling conducted in the weeks following the hearing showed increased public support for requiring detailed disclosure of committee business, with majorities across party lines expressing support for reforms that would prevent the kind of contradictions Crockett had documented. The institutional changes continued to unfold over the following months. The Congressional Research Service published a comprehensive analysis of transparency requirements across all committees, identifying systematic gaps that allowed for the kind of private negotiations Jordan had conducted while claiming complete transparency. Committee chairs from both parties began modifying their practices, apparently recognizing that future oversight hearings might subject them to similar evidence based accountability. The era of making broad transparency claims without detailed documentation seemed to be ending as the Crockett Standard became a new benchmark for congressional oversight. 6 months after the hearing, Jordan published a statement on his official website that represented a significant departure from his initial response. While stakeholder engagement remains an essential component of effective legislation, I recognize the importance of ensuring that public characterizations of committee business accurately reflect the full scope of committee activities. I am committed to working with committee leadership to develop enhanced transparency protocols that meet the highest standards of public accountability. The acknowledgement, unprecedented for Jordan, reflected the lasting impact of Crockett's systematic approach to accountability. By documenting contradictions with irrefutable evidence rather than relying on partisan accusations, she had created a new standard for congressional oversight that transcended traditional political divisions. For her part, Crockett used her elevated platform to advocate for systematic transparency reforms throughout Congress. Her approach had proven that accountability didn't require partisan attacks or inflammatory rhetoric. It simply required thorough preparation and systematic documentation of contradictions between public claims and private reality. The broader implications continue to reverberate through American politics. What began as a single committee hearing has potentially reshaped how transparency is understood and enforced in the legislative process. The Crockett Standard, comprehensive documentation of contradictions between public statements and private actions, has become a template for accountability that extends far beyond Congress. Government watchdog organizations have adopted similar methodologies for monitoring other institutions, recognizing that systematic evidence presentation is far more effective than traditional advocacy approaches. The precision and thoroughness that characterized Crockett's approach has become a model for anyone seeking to challenge institutional opacity with documented evidence. As we continue to process the significance of this moment, one truth remains clear. What happened in that committee room represented more than a confrontation between two representatives or a dispute about one piece of legislation. It was a demonstration that systematic preparation and comprehensive documentation can still triumph over institutional opacity and procedural deflection. The American people witnessed proof that accountability is possible when evidence is presented with precision and thoroughness. The question now is whether this represents a turning point toward greater transparency or simply an isolated example of what effective oversight can accomplish when someone is willing to do the necessary work. The answer may depend on whether other members of Congress are prepared to meet the standard that Representative Crockett established. That public statements about legislative transparency should actually reflect the documented reality of how laws are made in America. But there's more to this story that most people don't know. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling reveals just how deep this pattern of deception actually runs, and why what Crockett exposed was just the tip of a massive iceberg that threatens the very foundation of democratic governance in America. In the weeks following the hearing, investigative journalists began digging deeper into the documentation Crockett had presented. What they discovered was a sophisticated network of private negotiations that extended far beyond Jordan's committee and involved dozens of other legislative leaders who had been making similar transparency claims while conducting identical behind the scenes dealings. The Washington Post's investigative team, led by veteran congressional reporter Sarah Chen, obtained access to additional documents through Freedom of Information Act requests that built upon Crockett's initial revelations. What they found was staggering in its scope and implications for American democracy. We discovered that the methodology Representative Crockett used to expose Chairman Jordan could be applied to virtually every major piece of legislation passed in the last 3 years, Cheney later explained in an interview. The pattern of public transparency claims contradicted by private negotiations wasn't unique to Jordan or his committee. It was the standard operating procedure across Congress. The Post's investigation revealed that at least 17 different committee chairs had made public statements about transparency that were directly contradicted by authenticated meeting minutes, email communications, and other documented evidence of private negotiations with special interests. But perhaps most shocking was the discovery of what sources described as transparency theater playbooks, literal instruction manuals distributed among congressional offices that outlined strategies for maintaining public claims of openness while conducting substantive negotiations in private. One manual, obtained from a senior staffer who spoke on condition of anonymity, contained explicit instructions. Public messaging must emphasize procedural openness and stakeholder access, while actual policy negotiations remain strictly confidential. Never acknowledge private discussions that might suggest special interest influence. Instead, characterize all provisions as products of committee deliberation, regardless of their actual origin. The systematic nature of this deception began to emerge as more whistleblowers came forward. Dr. Amanda Foster, a former legislative analyst who had worked with multiple House committees, revealed that she had been instructed to maintain separate documentation systems, one for public disclosure that emphasized transparency, and another for internal use that documented the actual decision-making process. I was explicitly told that my job was to create public records that supported transparency claims while ensuring that evidence of private negotiations was compartmentalized and protected from oversight requests, Foster explained in testimony before the House Ethics Committee. This wasn't happening in one office or with one issue. It was standard practice across multiple committees in both parties. The revelation that transparency theater was an institutionalized practice rather than isolated incidents sent shockwaves through Washington's political establishment. Reform advocates, who had long suspected such systematic deception, suddenly had documented proof of what they had been alleging for years. But the implications extended far beyond Washington. In state legislatures across the country, similar patterns began to emerge as local journalists applied Crockett's methodology to their own legislative oversight. The California State Assembly, Texas Legislature, and Florida House all faced similar revelations as reporters used authentication procedures and systematic documentation to expose contradictions between public transparency claims and private reality. The ripple effects were immediate and far-reaching. Citizens groups in dozens of states began demanding access to the kinds of documentation that had proven so devastating in Crockett's presentation. Transparency advocacy organizations reported unprecedented interest in their monitoring programs as people realized that systematic accountability was actually possible. More importantly, the business community itself began to react to the exposure of private negotiation practices. Several major corporations that had participated in the documented private meetings issued statements distancing themselves from behind-the-scenes legislative influence, apparently recognizing that such arrangements had become a public relations liability. We are reviewing all of our legislative engagement practices to ensure they meet the highest standards of transparency and public accountability, read a statement from one Fortune 500 company, whose representatives had been documented in Jordan's private meetings. We believe that effective policy development requires open dialogue that can withstand public scrutiny. The corporate response revealed an important dynamic that Crockett's approach had created. By systematically documenting private negotiations, she had made participation in transparency theater a reputational risk for all involved parties, not just the legislators who had been making false public claims. This shift in corporate behavior had immediate policy implications. Lobbyists reported that their traditional approaches to legislative influence were becoming less effective as committee chairs became reluctant to engage in the kinds of private negotiations that had been standard practice for decades. The Crockett Standard has fundamentally changed how legislative business gets conducted, explained Maria Rodriguez, a veteran Washington lobbyist who represents environmental organizations. Nobody wants to risk being the next Chairman Jordan, so there's genuine pressure toward more transparent processes that can withstand documentary scrutiny. The academic community also took notice of the broader implications. Political science departments across the country began developing new research projects focused on systematic transparency accountability. Graduate students who had previously studied theoretical frameworks for democratic oversight suddenly had a concrete example of effective methodology that could be replicated and refined. Professor David Kim at Stanford's Political Science Department launched what became known as the Transparency Documentation Project, training graduate students to apply Crockett's systematic approach to legislative oversight at all levels of government. What Representative Crockett demonstrated wasn't just effective oversight of one chairman, Kim explained. She provided a template for evidence-based accountability that can be applied anywhere democratic institutions make public claims about their processes. This represents a fundamental shift from advocacy-based reform efforts to documentation-based accountability. The project's initial results were striking. Within 6 months, Kim's students had documented similar transparency contradictions in city councils, county commissions, and state legislatures across 12 different states. The methodology proved to be broadly applicable to any situation where public officials made specific claims about their processes that could be measured against documented evidence. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on journalism itself. News organizations that had traditionally relied on he said, she said political reporting began investing in the kinds of systematic documentation that had made Crockett's presentation so devastating. The Columbia Journalism Review published a comprehensive analysis of what they termed accountability documentation journalism, highlighting how Crockett's approach provided a template for moving beyond partisan political coverage toward evidence-based institutional accountability. Traditional political journalism often gets trapped in partisan frameworks that allow institutional problems to persist because they're framed as political disputes rather than accountability failures, wrote journalism professor Rebecca Martinez. The Crockett methodology demonstrates how systematic documentation can cut through partisan noise to create accountability that serves democratic rather than political interests. Major news organizations began dedicating resources to this approach. The New York Times established a congressional accountability unit specifically focused on applying systematic documentation techniques to legislative oversight. CNN launched a weekly segment called Documentation Check that used authentication procedures to verify or contradict public statements made by political figures. The impact on political discourse was immediate and measurable. Politicians who had grown accustomed to making broad claims about their processes without fear of systematic verification suddenly found themselves operating in an environment where comprehensive documentation could emerge at any time. This shift created what transparency advocates described as a accountability feedback loop. As more politicians recognized that their public statements might be systematically verified against documented evidence, the incentives began shifting toward greater actual transparency rather than just improved transparency theater. The feedback loop was reinforced by social media, where clips of politicians struggling to address documentary evidence became viral content that reached far beyond traditional political audiences. The visual impact of seeing leaders confronted with irrefutable proof of their contradictions proved to be politically devastating in ways that traditional partisan attacks had never achieved. 6 months after Crockett's initial presentation, polls showed that public trust in congressional transparency claims had reached historic lows, but support for systematic transparency reforms had reached historic highs. This created a political dynamic where opposition to documentation-based accountability became increasingly difficult to justify. The electoral implications began to emerge in subsequent campaigns. Candidates who could demonstrate systematic transparency in their own records gained significant advantages over opponents who relied on traditional claims that couldn't withstand documentary scrutiny. In the 2024 midterm elections, Several incumbent representatives who had been exposed through Crockett-style documentation faced unexpectedly strong challenges from opponents who made systematic transparency a central campaign issue. The political effectiveness of evidence-based accountability had moved beyond congressional hearings into electoral politics itself. But the most profound impact may have been on civic education and citizen engagement. High school civics classes across the country began incorporating documentation-based accountability into their curricula, teaching students not just how government is supposed to work, but how to systematically verify whether it actually works that way. College-level political science programs reported unprecedented enrollment in courses focused on legislative oversight and transparency accountability. Students who had previously viewed politics as partisan theater suddenly understood that systematic documentation could create real accountability regardless of political affiliation. This educational impact had generational implications. Young people who learned to expect documentation-based accountability were less likely to accept traditional political claims without verification, creating long-term pressure for more systematic transparency across all levels of government. The international community also took notice. Democratic institutions in other countries began studying the Crockett methodology as a template for strengthening their own accountability frameworks. Parliamentary systems in several European countries implemented similar documentation requirements for committee business after studying the American example. What happened in that American congressional hearing represents a breakthrough in democratic accountability that has applications far beyond the United States, observed Dr. Heinrich Müller, a specialist in comparative government at Oxford University. The methodology provides a framework for holding democratic institutions accountable to their transparency claims regardless of political system or cultural context. The global interest reinforced the significance of what had occurred in that committee room. What began as one representative's systematic preparation had evolved into an international template for strengthening democratic accountability through evidence-based oversight. As we approach the second anniversary of Crockett's initial presentation, the long-term implications continue to unfold. What started as exposure of one chairman's contradictions has evolved into a fundamental shift in how democratic accountability operates in America and beyond. The transformation hasn't been without resistance. Institutional forces that benefited from transparency theater have pushed back against documentation-based accountability, arguing that such systematic oversight interferes with the informal relationship building that effective governance requires. Some legislative leaders have attempted to modify procedures to make the kind of systematic documentation that Crockett employed more difficult to obtain or authenticate. These efforts have generally failed due to public pressure, but they reveal the ongoing tension between traditional institutional practices and emerging accountability standards. The resistance has also come from unexpected sources. Some transparency advocacy organizations initially struggled with the shift from advocacy-based reform efforts to documentation-based accountability, finding that their traditional approaches were less effective than systematic evidence presentation. We had to completely rethink our methodology, explained Jennifer Walsh, director of the Government Accountability Institute. For years, we focused on making arguments about why transparency mattered. Suddenly, we realized that documenting specific contradictions between claims and reality was far more effective than any argument we could make. This shift in advocacy strategy has had broader implications for how reform organizations operate. Groups that successfully adapted to documentation-based approaches have seen significant increases in their effectiveness, while those that continue to rely on traditional advocacy methods have found themselves increasingly marginalized from accountability discussions. The business community's response has also evolved in unexpected ways. While some corporations initially viewed increased transparency requirements as burdensome, others recognized that systematic documentation could actually benefit legitimate business interests by exposing the preferential treatment that had been given to competitors through private negotiations. Level playing field transparency actually helps honest businesses compete more effectively, explained Thomas Chen, CEO of a manufacturing company that had been excluded from the private meetings documented in Jordan's case. When regulatory decisions are made through documented processes rather than private deals, companies that follow the rules aren't disadvantaged against those with special access. This business community split has created new political dynamics around transparency reform. Reform efforts now include supporters from across the political spectrum, including business leaders who recognize that systematic transparency can benefit competition and economic efficiency. The technological implications have been equally significant. Software companies have developed specialized tools for authentication and documentation that make the kind of systematic oversight Crockett employed more accessible to journalists, citizens groups, and oversight organizations. These technological developments have democratized accountability in ways that would have been impossible just a few years ago. Citizens groups with limited resources can now conduct the kind of systematic documentation analysis that previously required extensive professional expertise and institutional access. The democratization of accountability tools has created what researchers describe as a distributed oversight network, where systematic accountability can emerge from multiple sources rather than depending on individual representatives or journalists with exceptional preparation and resources. As this network continues to develop, the long-term implications for democratic governance become increasingly significant. The era of making public claims that can't withstand documentary scrutiny appears to be ending, replaced by an environment where systematic accountability is an ongoing reality rather than an exceptional occurrence. The transformation represents more than just improved oversight. It reflects a fundamental shift in the relationship between democratic institutions and the citizens they serve. When systematic documentation becomes the standard for accountability rather than the exception, the incentives governing institutional behavior change in ways that strengthen democracy itself. Looking forward, the question isn't whether documentation-based accountability will continue to expand, but how quickly democratic institutions will adapt to operate effectively under systematic transparency standards. The evidence suggests that this adaptation is already underway, creating the foundation for more accountable and responsive governance that serves democratic rather than institutional interests. The story that began with one representative's careful preparation has evolved into a new chapter in American democratic development. What Jasmine Crockett started in that committee room continues to reshape how accountability functions in democratic societies, proving that systematic preparation and comprehensive documentation can still triumph over institutional opacity and create the transparency that democracy requires to function effectively.